Oh, hello, hello, interwebs. What's up, Heinz? Give a few minutes to get a couple people in here, and then we're gonna get rolling. I really would like to try to get through most, if not all, of these tonight. So we'll give it a couple of minutes. And we will be doing this in chronological order. From time to time, I will ask the chat, their thoughts. I got a couple of people in here now. We got about one more minute, and then we'll get rolling. While we wait, anyone in the chat, go ahead and drop who is your favorite president. Mine's Lincoln. Yeah, this is gonna be my tier list, Heinz. This is gonna be my personal thoughts on where I would put all the presidents. And just, I'm doing the standard list, S, A, B, C, D, F, and not applicable. I really think there's only like 2 that go in that spot. And I'll go ahead and throw them. Jackman, what's up? Gotta be FDR. That's a solid pick. He's definitely, you guys can't see him, but he is on the wall as well. Ulysses Grant. Personally, I like Grant. You can see him on the wall. I wouldn't say he's the best president ever, though. I'm going to go ahead and throw Garfield into the non-applicable. And let's see, where's old Harrison? I'm going to go ahead and throw him in there, too. Neither of them really lived long enough to do anything of any merit. Ranking presidents is one of my favorite historical games. Well, hopefully you have some fun tonight. All right, so we'll go ahead and get going, guys. This is the water of, is wet. This is the coldest take ever. Washington is S tier. There's only a handful of presidents off the top of my head, 3, maybe 4 that go in the S tier. Obviously, what can you say about Washington that hasn't been said already? All the precedents that we have for the presidency come from him, and also Alexander Hamilton being a great influence on his presidency. But very magnanimous. The man knew how to use power in the right ways. He knew when to walk away. And George Washington simply S tier. I don't think anyone would argue against that. I'll give the chat a couple seconds if they want to drop any quick remarks before we move on to President 2, John Adams. Easy S tier. Yeah, I agree. He's also on the wall. So again, for anyone who doesn't know, there's 8 presidents on my wall: Washington, Lincoln, Grant, Roosevelt, other Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and LBJ. Wherever are you wearing Thomas Jefferson then, because he also has his impacts. Jefferson does have his impacts on Washington's administration, but very, very few. If you read Hamilton, Ron Chernow book, you'll really see that more often than not, Washington defers to Hamilton over Jefferson, and that's why Jefferson ends up resigning as Secretary of State. All right, so now we'll move on to number 2, John Adams. Now, and just for, and I should have done this, initially, but here are my criteria for judging a presidency, and we're only judging presidencies. John Adams is a great founding father, but has nothing to do with him as the president. All right, so my criteria are domestic policy, foreign policy, character, communication, and long-term impact. So those are my brief criteria. Now, John Adams, on a foreign policy stance, nothing really, exciting there. War's already over. We haven't quite gotten to the War of 1812 yet, and that really won't be incited until Jefferson rolls along. On the domestic policy front, Alien and Sedition Acts are garbage. I don't know that anyone would argue that. Adams was kind of the original Woodrow Wilson in the sense that he really thought he was just the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that if you argued with him, you're just an idiot and you don't know what you're talking about. Both as vice president and as president, he spent so much time out of D.C., just up in Massachusetts, doing nothing. For me, Adams is an easy D tier. And as a founding father, Adams would have to be A or S tier, obviously, for all his contributions to the country. But as a president, absolute dog water. Trying to keep an eye on the chat, make sure I don't miss anything. All right, Thomas Jefferson. So this one's gonna be a little controversial. The Adams is underrated. Alien Sedition Acts have been abused, but they're fundamentally sound. I disagree. I think they're an encroachment on the First Amendment. Now, to be fair, in practice, I think only a dozen people ever actually got indicted and convicted under the Alien and Sedition Acts. With that said, for someone who was such a champion of personal liberties as Adams, I find it incredibly hypocritical. I could probably be convinced that Adams is a C tier. At the end of this, we'll rearrange them a little bit if popular consensus in the chat. But for right now, I'm going to leave Adams in D tier. Jefferson. So I'm not a big Thomas Jefferson guy. I don't like him as a human being. I think he's fundamentally flawed, and his Embargo Act at the end of his term leads directly to a panic and to the War of 1812. With that said, sorry, I'm adjusting my lights here. With that said, Jefferson doubles the size of the country overnight, albeit with some probably unconstitutional behavior. So Jefferson, for me, got to go in the A tier. The area of good feeling starts under Jefferson, extends all the way through Monroe. The only time we've seen the same political party, well, up until that point anyway, seen the same political party rule for 24 straight years. Wouldn't happen again until FDR and Truman under the Democrats. You can't argue with success. Jefferson, and as president, goes against a lot of his own principles, which probably would have gotten in the way. The Louisiana Purchase being one, because he knew he didn't have the constitutional authority to make it. So Congress supported it, but initially they didn't. He kind of just approved it kind of preemptively. They did later. It's kind of like a lot of what Lincoln did during the Civil War, where he just kind of assumed the authority to do things, and Congress later giving it to him. But initially, he just kind of negotiated it with Napoleon on his own. Jefferson supervises the building of West Point, although he disagrees with having a standing army. He definitely, his long-term impacts for me keep him out of being S tier along with a lot of his character. But, a lot of the problem with modern conservative politics starts with Jefferson. But as president, I don't think it can be argued he did a fantastic job. Up until the end, anyway. Again, the Embargo Act of 1807 was not good, led to an economic depression, led to the War of 1812. These are bad things. And for anyone jumping in, we're just doing a standard presidential tier ranking. Feel free to drop your favorite president in the chat. And we are going all the way to the end, and we're not stopping at like the year 2000. We are going all the way to Trump, Biden, Trump, however you want to conclude that. Yeah, doubling the size of the country is goated, legal or not. James Madison. Again, Madison and Monroe are both very much students of Jefferson. Madison, obviously, again, a great champion of constitutional democracy. With that said, he doesn't have a lot of the panache that Jefferson does, as a lot of what he does is just continuation of the Jeffersonian thought, the era of good feelings, as I previously said. He does. I don't blame him for the War of 1812. Obviously, I leave that at Jefferson's feet. I don't blame him for the burning of the White House. He wasn't even there. It was actually leading troops in battle. The only time we've had a sitting president do that. Um, so for me, Madison, B tier. And then we're going to go ahead and slide Monroe right next to him. Because again, I feel like their presidencies are basically the same. The Monroe Doctrine, although that should really be given credit to John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State, who we're going to get to in a minute. The idea of, you know, other countries staying out of our hemisphere isn't necessarily the worst idea we've ever had. And, it worked pretty well for a while until it didn't, I suppose. But Madison and Monroe both, they're both very underhanded and conniving characters. If I really recommend Ron Chernow's Hamilton and his book on Washington, you kind of see a lot of their skeezy, underhanded behavior. A lot of what happens to Alexander Hamilton happens because of James Monroe. But again, as president, and this was the first of only 2 instances where you've had 3 consecutive presidencies where they were elected to consecutive terms, and it doesn't happen again until Clinton, Bush, and Obama around the turn of the 20th century. All right, on to John Quincy Adams. I like him better than his dad. Obviously, while sharing a lot of similarities, let's see. Garfield served a full 2 or 3. Oh, if Garfield served 2 or 3 terms, would have easily been S tier. The man was smartest president by far. Also, was fighting for African Americans, making impact on the U.S. for civil service reform. I agree. I do fundamentally believe that if Garfield had lived, he'd probably be up here somewhere. But again, we'll just never know. But John Quincy Adams definitely doesn't have quite the rough edges as his father, but his presidency is a little lackluster and kind of toothless. He spends a lot of it fighting the Southern governments, trying to stop Indian removal, and ultimately he's unsuccessful. I mean, he doesn't even win the popular vote when he gets brought into office in the first place, and he gets soundly defeated by Andrew Jackson in I believe it's the election of 1832, if I'm not mistaken. So for me, John Quincy Adams is a C tier. And speaking of Old Hickory himself, Andrew Jackson. Again, if you're a more conservative person, if you lean more into the idea of small federal government, then you're going to love Andrew Jackson. For me, the Trail of Tears, which gets started under his presidency, although most of it's carried out under Martin Van Buren. The refusal to renew the charter for the I believe it's the Second Bank of America leads to a huge economic depression under Van Buren, and I believe in 1837. So Jackson would have been elected in 28 the first time. But just other than really stopping the secession of South Carolina, Jackson's presidency is just one big piece of dog water. Jackson's legacy has been fighting this country in the ass ever since. I agree. So for me, Jackson's our first F tier. You're not wrong, Hines. There's always been a desire to push the Native Americans out of their where they are to somewhere else so we could steal the things that were there. But Jackson is the one that made it official federal policy and made it law. Not to mention that when the Supreme Court says, "Hey, you can't do that," he basically tells them to kiss his ass. And again, respecting the co-equal branches of government is kind of what the Constitution's all about. And you can't be a good commander-in-chief if you're not going to do the one thing that you are tasked with doing, and that is preserving, protecting, and defending the Constitution of the United States. So, with that said, Jackson's down there. Van Buren, while not great, and very much Andrew Jackson's protege, gets saddled with a lot of things. So, for example, the economic depression I mentioned earlier, I don't put that on Van Buren. With that said, he doesn't do a lot to fix it. To me, he's Jackson light, and he's D tier. Now, obviously, we already put William Henry Harrison in non-alphabet. Let's see. I know I'm going to sound a little disagreement, but technically speaking, he didn't ignore the Supreme Court. What they said, it was difficult for him to do that. You could make that argument. With that said, his exact words were, "They've made their ruling, now let's see them enforce it." So whether it was easy for him to comply or not, he refused to comply. So that's not good. But again, that's not a bad nuance to add. So obviously William Henry Harrison dies a month into his term, doesn't really get to do anything, and then John Tyler takes over. Now John Tyler, I am not a fan of. He was so disagreeable, he gets rejected by his own party to run for re-election. Just an unabashed scumbag, really. And it's because he had such an inferiority complex for being called his accidency, because he ascends to the presidency by accident. And really, the Tyler precedent, which until I believe it's the 25th Amendment, whichever one established the presidential succession, we kind of just operated under the idea that the vice president becomes the president and is not just acting as such. John Tyler actually joins the Confederacy, is elected to a seat in their Congress, and dies before he can take it, and is actually the only president buried under a Confederate flag. Let's see. That is not exactly what Jackson said. The quote itself was 30 years after he died. What he actually said was the Supreme Court is stillborn. Different context. Jackson might have started the Trail of Tears, so that way he's D tier, while Van Buren is F because he just made the Trail of Tears just 1,000 times worse. It's one of the worst things ever to happen. I absolutely agree. But we have to keep in mind that the presidency in those days was mostly an administrative job. Jackson was kind of the first populist president in that way of pushing his own agenda. We might move Van Buren down to F, but for me, S tier and F tier have to be reserved for the ultimate best and worst. If there's any redeeming qualities, they go up to D. If there's anything bringing them down, they go down to A. So for me, I want to use S and F a little more sparingly. We'll see how we come away once we're done. Maybe we'll do some adjustments. But I'm going to leave Van Buren at D for right now. But back to John Tyler. To me, an abysmal president. My own personal feelings want me to put him in F, but I'm going to put him in D. All right, on to James Polk. Now, again, he's kind of an anomaly in the sense that he looks at the presidency, makes a list of goals, and says, I'm going to do this in one term, and I'm not going to run for re-election because I'm not going to need to. And a lot of that was not good stuff, like the Mexican War. But with that said, he is the president that added more land to the United States than any other president. He succeeded in everything he set out to do, and while you might disagree with it, and I certainly do disagree with it, you can't argue with the success. So I'm going to put Polk in B tier. The Mexican War was obviously a war of aggression. If not for that, I probably would move him up maybe even to A. But his personal dealings with the military, getting Zachary Taylor's way, removing him towards the end of the war so he wouldn't have a prominent place, because he felt he would be competition in the next election, which obviously he was because he won. But to me, that kind of thing brings him down. But still, you can't argue with the success of a presidency. So I'm going to leave him at B. Now, Zachary Taylor. He's kind of like Grant in a sense that he initially didn't seek the presidency. He just gets elected because of basically popular will of the people, saying, you're such a successful general, we just want you to run this thing. Obviously, hero of the Mexican War. Now, he only lives about 18 months of his presidency before getting sick. I believe they actually dug him up in 1990 to check him for arsenic poisoning, which was not there. He ate some bad cherries and stuff, probably drinking the tainted water in D.C., probably what also killed William Henry Harrison, and probably also killed Zachary or Polk shortly after his term, because he dies almost immediately after leaving office. Polk is pretty good, I would say, but was a supporter of slavery and a close friend of Andrew Jackson. Not a good look, but still good. So we're going to try to stick to some historical relevancy here. If slavery is a factor here, literally every president from here all the way to Lincoln, minus the ones from Massachusetts, owned slaves. So that's not good. That's obviously abysmal, and there's no redeeming that. But with that said, we can't make that the only judgment of a presidency. Just to be as unbiased as is possible to do. It's just too lazy to say owned slaves, terrible president. Now, again, if we were doing this as a ranking of human beings, then a lot of these guys would be a lot lower. Washington would be a lot lower. Jefferson would be a lot lower. Monroe would be a lot lower. but it's just too easy to say slave owner, bring them down. But one thing that Taylor does do blocks what would have been the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But obviously, once he dies, and we're going to go ahead and slide him into C tier. Didn't have as much time to do a lot of stuff, and he really didn't understand politics very well. But for having the foresight to oppose, slavery and its expansion, and to kind of meddle with what was already the sort of the status quo. Because after Taylor, we're just going to get a bunch of presidents that kick the can down the road on the slavery issue leading up to the Civil War. So we're going to slide him here. Obviously, Alec Baldwin, his vice president, takes over, Millard Fillmore, and he immediately signs the Compromise of 1850. And this is kind of a theme we see here, where all these northern presidents are siding with slavery, and a lot of the ones that were of southern descent didn't necessarily side with it. For me, Fillmore is gonna be, oh god, D or F. Oh, D or F. I'm gonna put him in D. One of our weaker executives, probably one of the few presidents that if you polled 1,000 people in the street, no one would know the name Millard Fillmore. I would agree with that. I agree slavery was wrong, had nothing to do with their actual actions as president. That's what I'm trying to go for here. Fillmore, again, weak executive, but with these next couple, we'll see that there are things that can make you an even worse president. Speaking of which, Franklin Pierce, F tier. Obviously, let's see. Do you feel bad for Pierce because of what happened to his son? So I was actually about to get to that. So for those who don't know, Pierce is like a lot of the people in the 19th century whose children kind of dropped like flies. I believe he had 3, 2 of which died from disease. And upon being inaugurated for president, him and his family were traveling on a train to D.C. And there was an accident where there's a train accident. His son basically gets decapitated in front of him. And that leads to him spending his entire presidency basically drinking himself stupid. With that said, there are other presidents that have been in similar situations that rose to the occasion. Obviously, the Kansas-Nebraska Act leads to the prequel to the Civil War, leads to Bleeding Kansas. Just wrong guy at the wrong place in the wrong time. If Pierce comes along 20 years before or after in different circumstances, could have been better. I do feel for the guy. I have 2 children myself, and I feel bad for the man. But as a president, you are chosen among the millions of people in this country to be the leader. And Pierce had actually gotten out of politics, another hero of the Mexican War. He's out of politics, and he gets nominated at the convention and to be the Democrat nominee. So, obviously, he doesn't get reelected. We get our next F-tier president, who many would argue is the worst, James Buchanan. Zachary Taylor is B tier, in my opinion. Even though he owned slaves, he was not a supporter of slavery, and that's why if he didn't die of cholera, he probably would have been A tier. I agree. I might move him up to B. There's something to be said about having a principle in the abstract, but then doing the right thing. And we'll see a lot of other presidents here that go against what would have been kind of their own bad, convictions when it was the right time to do so. James Buchanan, just the definition of an inept, weak executive. He knew what the result of the Dred Scott decision was going to be before it was announced. So it was very easy for him to sit there and say, well, we're just going to do what the court says. Obviously, that leads to some very bad things. When the South secedes, he basically says, yes, it's illegal, but I don't really have the power to do anything about it. And he just kind of lets it happen. Just the most feckless, inept president we've ever had. Easy F tier. Bottom 3, bottom 4 president. I don't think anyone would advocate for James Buchanan being anything above F tier. Now we get to the next of only a handful of S tier presidents, Abraham Lincoln. Only neo-Confederates and lost causes would suggest he's anything but one of, if not our best presidents. Obviously, the Civil War falls into his lap just by the sheer fact that a Republican was nominated. But handles the war brilliantly, one of our most brilliant politicians to ever hold the office. Someone of incredible magnanimity. If you ever read about Lincoln, you'll hear how he handles slights so well. Chase, his Secretary of the Treasury tries to usurp the nomination in 1864, and to get rid of him, but also because he thought he would do the job well, names him to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Just to me, if there was a human being in history that I could spend 5 minutes talking to, it would be Abraham Lincoln. I'm reading another book about him right now. I just finished a couple, but I'm reading. It's called Lincoln's Gamble. It's about the 6 months leading up to the Emancipation Proclamation. The only few failures that people truly criticize are Native American suspension of habeas corpus. So here's the thing about the suspension of habeas corpus. Now, obviously, Lincoln was not a great friend to Native Americans. And there's no defending that. But I think it gets blown out of proportion. He was a little too busy fighting the Civil War to worry about genociding all the Native Americans. A lot of that doesn't really come kind of until the late 19th century with Sherman in charge of the military. In terms of suspension of habeas corpus, initially when he does it, it's only along the rail lines leading to D.C. so that Congress can actually get there to convene. Because if they can't even get there to sign off on his suspension of habeas corpus, which eventually they did. And when he suspended habeas corpus for the entire country, again, Congress backed it. So while he would get get ahead of himself, he kind of didn't have a choice. When Congress is adjourned for months at a time during a literal rebellion, what else is he to do? He definitely bent the Constitution as much as he could, but he did it in the name of protecting it. So you could agree to disagree with his methods, but I don't think you could disagree with the outcomes. So to me, Lincoln is our best president. It's not even close, and easy S tier. Now, on to who, for me, for the longest time, was the worst president of all time, and is still in my bottom two. Andrew Johnson, easy F tier. The man who single-handedly helped civil rights get held back 100 years in this country, just trying to veto every piece of Reconstruction legislation that went through Congress during his term. Just an increasingly argumentative man. In many ways, a drunken slob at his own inauguration as vice president. Tommy Lee Jones time, there you go. Is there really nothing good that Andrew Johnson did? He left some of Lincoln's cabinet in place. And honestly, his handling of Reconstruction wasn't necessarily all that different from what Lincoln's would have been initially. But he almost immediately just becomes overly lenient. Leaving Grant in place was not a bad thing. But other than just not going more apeshit and tearing more stuff up, I can't see a single redeeming quality about Andrew Johnson, to the point where they literally created a law, the Tenure of Office Act, knowing that he would break it so they just could impeach him at the end of his term anyway, just to get rid of him even sooner. So Andrew Johnson, the worst decision Lincoln ever made was replacing Hannibal Hamlin with Andrew Johnson on his ticket. The only reason why Lincoln is not my go is because he chose the second worst vice president at the time. Andrew Johnson is vice president. That's why FDR is the GOAT and Lincoln's at 2. So again, Lincoln could not have foreseen what was going to happen. Andrew Johnson was pretty popular. He was the only senator from a seceding state to not leave his seat. That's why he gets made wartime governor of Tennessee. He is a staunch unionist, and a lot of that, and he was an opponent of slavery, mostly to help defend the poor yeoman white farmers. But he was very popular, so you could understand why he did it. This is more of a hindsight thing. In Illinois, we like Grant. He's my personal favorite. Yeah, I would imagine Grant's pretty popular in the Midwest, being from Ohio. Lincoln didn't really have a choice to choose Andrew Johnson. He had to get him. I disagree. Lincoln, he was overly afraid of losing the election in 64. But I think if he had kept Hannibal Hamlin on the ticket, he still would have won. Speaking of Ulysses S. Grant, a personal favorite of mine. I love the man. He saved the Union. But he was overly naive. He was way too trusting. Both of his vice presidents and a lot of his cabinet were just corrupt bastards. He had the foresight to kind of go against the political machine in one sense, in choosing his own cabinet and not letting cronies do it. And he sort of started bucking the system of and was not called Lincoln. Definitely had better choices. again, under the auspices of a constitutional union ticket, I could see the justification for Johnson, although I disagree with it. But Grant, obviously, a staunch proponent of Reconstruction and enfranchisement to the slaves or the freedmen. So for me, he goes in B. Obviously, none of the corruption was his fault. And again, Ron Chernow has a fantastic book about Grant that I would recommend. Trusting people again by 1880, when he floats the idea of coming back for a third term, he's definitely in the New York pocket, Roscoe Conkling, definitely in the spoil system. So that's another reason that keeps him from being higher for me. B or C2 for Grant, yeah. I could see the justification of putting Grant in C. I just think his character for me goes too high, and I'm glad that revisionist history is kind of helping to elevate not only his time as a Union general, but also as president, because for so long, the Lost Cause also took a toll on Grant's presidency and the way that he was remembered. So I'm very happy to see him moved up. Now on to another middling Republican president from Ohio, and there's kind of a trend of these going on here. Rutherford Hayes, gonna toss him into C tier. So Hayes obviously gets elected, with his kind of his deal that upon getting elected, he would end Reconstruction and pull the troops out of the South. We have to keep in mind that Samuel Tilden would have done the same thing. So Hayes being there kind of kept some of the good Republican policies going, even though his, and you also have to keep in mind the public perception of Reconstruction, it was over. Amazing beard for Hayes. That man does have a good beard. We had a good run of fantastic presidential facial hair, didn't we? We need to bring more of that back. One of the good things J.D. Vance has done is made a beard on a vice president normal again. But for me, Hayes gets too much flack for the Rutherford thing and pulling the troops out, ending Reconstruction. That was going to happen regardless. At least we get to keep a Republican president to stop some of the bleeding in terms of swapping rule back over to the southern states, although that happens anyway. But I think it's overblown how bad he was, so I'm going to leave him right there. Now, obviously, Garfield. Why did that stop though? What's wrong with presidents having beards? It's a bad thing now. So it ends after Taft, and I think just for it being that way for so long, people just kind of viewed it as unprofessional and unkempt, I suppose. Let me guess. Thomas Woodrow Wilson goes in the Birth of a Nation tier. Vance's beard is as awful as the rest of his life. Keep the presidents clean shaven. I don't like Vance, but I gotta disagree there. I like facial hair. If I could grow a better beard, I would let it go out more. I love me a good beard. We need more of that. So obviously Chester Arthur takes over after the death of Garfield. And for me, for again, someone who, like Grant, was a kind of a product of the New York scene under Roscoe Conkling and the spoil system. And you see this a lot in Death by Lightning. A little overcharacterized, caricaturized. I can't speak. As president, he gets his act together, and he really does his best to enact what he viewed as Garfield's vision for the country. And for me, Chester Arthur is an easy B tier. It's a shame that he couldn't get reelected. He wasn't very popular by the end of the term. But his civil service reform, unquestionably a good thing for the country. Meritocracy is not a bad thing. You should not just be handed a job because your crony won the election. And that still kind of happens to a degree. But I think overall, Arthur's presidency was better than many people remember to be. Moving on, Grover Cleveland, the first president to be elected non-consecutively. And I'm going to just group both of his terms in together. Kind of one of the original horn dogs, a lot of misconduct, bastard children going on here. Kind of an evil guy. And also, as president, has, a cancerous tumor removed from the roof of his mouth on a boat in the middle of the ocean. I still think it's too early to rank Biden, the Orange, and maybe Obama. We'll talk about that when we get there. But for me, Cleveland, for as good as a president can be in the late 19th century, I'm going to put him in C tier. Nothing great, nothing awful. Just kind of a middle of the road guy. And I'm going to put Benjamin Harrison in the same place. You got to give a guy credit for knocking out an incumbent, although he got knocked back out in the election of 1892. But Harrison, or Cleveland, I should say, the first Democrat elected since Lincoln, and the last one we would get until Wilson. So Harrison pops back in for a term and back out again. Nothing great, nothing awful. McKinley. So McKinley's a bit of a tough one. He was incredibly popular in his time, and he was certainly keeping up with the rest of the world in terms of the imperialism, which we would view as bad, and I personally view as bad. The tariffs, not as bad as they are now, because the protectionism is a lot different in the early 20th century, when we're still building the infrastructure and the industrialization that we see take off during the Gilded Age and kind of see its peak in the early 1900s. And obviously picked, one of the best vice presidents of all time. But for me, McKinley, I'm going to put him... I'm going to put him in D tier. I'm not a big fan of slaughtering people and handing out medals of honor for it. McKinley was the man. Not a fan of McKinley. Now, his vice president, I like that guy. I like him a lot. You know what? Arthur goes F easily for signing the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah, that's definitely a thing that keeps him from being higher for me. We have to keep in mind, though, again, the political and economic nature and the social nature of the country at the time. That's nothing that no other president would have done, and it's not good, and it's definitely a deterrent. And we might move Arthur down to C. We'll play around with this at the end and do some final last-minute adjustments. I can not be a fan of McKinley, but ranked James K. Polk highly. Explain that one to me, Hines. I'm not quite sure what you mean. One thing about the Mexican War, you have to understand, like with Texas, for example, Texas wanted to be a part of the U.S. The places that McKinley was going around and taking didn't want to be. The Philippines didn't want to be part of the U.S., Hawaii, all that stuff. That, again, nothing that other countries weren't doing, but his imperialism was a lot more brutal. I guess would be the way of putting it. Yeah, again, there's nothing wrong with being an expansionist in and of itself. It's the way in which it was gone about. It's different degrees of these things. And again, we'll play around with this at the end. We might move McKinley up, might move Arthur down. We'll have a discussion at the end. But for me right now, I'm just going to put McKinley at D. And I'm still debating between C and D. We'll toss McKinley at C. Now, on to another goated president, Teddy effing Roosevelt. To me, Teddy is S tier. He deserves his place on Mount Rushmore. From the national park stuff to the trust busting, and although he didn't go as far as I would have liked him to see, inviting African Americans to the White House, which we hadn't seen for some time. To me, Teddy is just the epitome of the popular imagination, the idea of making the presidency the bullhorn to really bring fundamental change about. And he was a tough son of a bitch. The kind of, there are very few presidents, and actually all three in S tier are kind of in the script, that you would not want to screw with. Teddy Roosevelt was one of those. The man literally willed asthma out of his system. Would you change any faces on Mount Rushmore if you could? I'd probably swap out Jefferson. Now, so let me put it this way. Given when it was erected, I think it's correct. If I were to change one now, I would swap Jefferson maybe for FDR, or Truman or Eisenhower. But no, I don't think Mount Rushmore in and of itself, there's nothing aggressively wrong with it. But Teddy, easy S tier president for me. Now Taft, obviously the kind of proto Teddy Roosevelt, has the cojones to go against the man, because he, Roosevelt tries to come back and take the presidency back because he's unhappy with the way Taft is kind of dialing back some of his policies. Keeps up the trust busting, keeps up, a lot of the national park stuff, but he's not quite as aggressive with a lot of the things as Teddy was. Obviously, the only president to go on to be on the Supreme Court afterward. But for me, Taft, I'm going to put him in B. I think he's a little underrated for some people, but I'm going to toss him in B. Now, this one might get me in some trouble. It may not. Woodrow Wilson. Now, the blame for this man lies at the feet of this man. Because if Teddy doesn't pitch his little hissy fit, run with the Bull Moose Party, and siphon votes away from Taft, we would never have been saddled with Woodrow Wilson, who, for me, is an easy F tier. The birth of the nation stuff, the racism, he was a fan of eugenics. Uh-oh, you're not going to rank him at the worst? Oh, no. Awful. Dog water president. Wilson is absolutely abysmal. Resegregating the government. And you'll see people like Monsieur Z that try to justify all this racist conservative nonsense. You could have easily had a progressive president that expands the federal government, led us through World War I, that didn't do all the stupid stuff Wilson did. An unreconstructed Southerner. He's elected from New Jersey, but he's from Virginia. Has a PhD in history, which from Princeton. But Woodrow Wilson, said he runs for re-election on we didn't get involved in World War I, and then immediately gets us involved in World War I. Had a huge messiah complex. His 14 points are brilliant. The League of Nations leading to the UN. Again, these are good things. But he couldn't even get the U.S. to sign on to his own plan. He was such a dickhead. That he saw Jefferson Davis flee after the Civil War. Yes. So when Davis is fleeing through Virginia, escaping after the fall of Richmond, that's one of Wilson's earliest recollections, seeing Jefferson Davis run away. So yes, that is true. What problem did Theodore have with the Taft presidency? He wasn't as aggressive with a lot of the trust busting stuff. If you read up on Taft, it's a lot like H.W. Bush and Reagan. Taft was much more was much more moderate than Teddy. And considering that Teddy kind of groomed him and handpicked him to be his successor, he would have liked to have seen him kind of basically just keep what he was doing on autopilot. Just started watching. The list is heavily respectable so far. Thank you, Connor. I appreciate that. This is absurd. Wilson invented the precursor to the United Nations. Yeah, but the United Nations is the most toothless, ineffective organization literally ever. If you are an international governing body that gives all the power to half a dozen nations and you have 150 members, what's really the point? The UN is there to police poor, small countries, really, and to do whatever the US and China and Russia say. So, again, on paper, it's a nice idea, but Wilson, to me, and there's a great quote I heard once. I think I actually heard it from Ben Shapiro, of all people. He said, the right hate Wilson for being progressive, the left hate him for being racist, so there's no one left to like him. And to me, that's true. In my opinion, Warren Harding is D tier, even though you have all the gambling stuff and supporting African Americans. Never died of heart attack, would be higher. So let's go ahead and get on to Harding. Harding, the man knew, there's a quote of Harding saying that basically, I'm not qualified to be the president. This job is too hard. As a human being, a terrible guy, ignores his own daughter her entire life, and basically his daughter lives her entire life and dies before it's actually confirmed that she was his daughter. But for me, Harding, while he eventually comes around and is a supporter of women's suffrage and things, just such a horribly inept president. Terribly popular, very popular in his day. But to me, Harding is easy teacher. I'm not going to put him in F. I don't think anything he did was that horribly abysmal to put him that low. Mr. Normalcy. I don't know if you could use that quote to say he's bad. A lot of presidents likely felt like that. Kennedy felt like that. Oh no, I'm not judging him that. It's just funny to me that one of our horribly inept, probably one of our dumber presidents, not necessarily in terms of education, but in terms of his actions as president, basically said I was never fit to be here. And he definitely didn't have to deal with the things that Kennedy had to deal with, or that many other presidents who struggled with the job that they were doing, like Lincoln, for example. who literally had to deal with the death of a son while commander in chief. I'm sure he had his own. I mean, he didn't think he was going to get reelected, but still did a fantastic job. Harding didn't do anything aggressively bad. D tier is accurate. Yeah, that's kind of my thing. He didn't do really enough good to move him up higher. I'm a big fan of professional wrestling, and there's a manager named Jim Cornette, and there's a quote I heard him say where so many other people did dumber shit than you that you got moved up without having to do anything. And to me, that's where Harding falls. Now on to another president who to me is terribly underrated, Calvin Coolidge. I think he gets brought down a lot by the left because he's Reagan's hero. But to me, there's nothing wrong with being the highest administrative job in the land and being just an effective administrator. To me, Coolidge is C tier. I think he gets a lot of flack for the Depression starting shortly after his term ends. I don't know that his economic policies directly lead to that. I don't know that they don't, but I think to me, especially these days, it's easy for me to look back on the days when the presidency wasn't a factor in people's lives. Why do you think Coolidge and Reagan are completely different, even if they both thought the government should be more hands-off? When we get to Reagan, I'll explain. Where was my thought going off there? Another president going by his middle name. Calvin Coolidge, yeah. Coolidge is above Wilson. I'm pissing Jackman off. Yeah, sorry, brother. Wilson's terrible. It's terrible. But Coolidge, yeah, I put him in C tier. And you know, he takes over for Harding, gets another term of his own, decides not to run again. Probably would have won. Pretty popular with the people. That story about him only the 2 words at the dinner, Mr. President, I have a bet with my friend I can get you to say more than 2 words, and he says you lose. I don't know that story is actually true. I think that's like the Taft getting stuck in the bathtub story where it's actually just a bunch of nonsense. But to me, Coolidge goes in C tier. Now, Herbert Hoover, he's another one of these presidents like James Buchanan or Martin Van Buren who, on paper, incredibly qualified to do the job. During World War I believe under the not the Taft administration, he ran logistics. So he was responsible for transporting food and stuff. I believe he does work under Taft administration, but I think he also works under Wilson. He pardoned a raccoon and made it his pet. That is true. And Calvin Coolidge was born on the 4th of July. A little interesting tidbit there. But Herbert Hoover, you know, like the other presidents I mentioned, did all the jobs in government you can do, and then just did a lackluster job. Now, Hoover, I'm going to put him in D. Again, I don't blame the Depression on Hoover, but his response was abysmal. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, while it didn't really make things as bad as people like to pretend that they did, he didn't do much to help. And a lot of people had this kind of Marie Antoinette view of his administration. I mean, literally, all the little pop-up shanty towns were called Hoover towns because people just felt he was doing nothing to help. So for me, Hoover, ineffective, bad place, bad time. Probably would have been better in another place. But D tier for me, not bad enough to be moved into F, because I give him credit for at least trying. Your opinion of the Bonus Army. Was that when the World War I veterans were protesting in DC to get the pay they were promised, and he sent in I think the regular army to deal with that? Is that what you're talking about? Mexican repatriation. Exactly. So I mean, there are redeeming qualities. It wasn't all bad. It was mostly bad, just not all bad. Yeah, so obviously TK, that's bad. And that's another reason that Hoover was incredibly unpopular. Veterans at that point in time were not necessarily as revered in the public as they are now, but at that point in time they were. And those veterans, what they were trying to do was they had been promised a payment that would have come, you know, years after their service, and they were trying to collect it early because they were unemployed and didn't have any money. And Hoover, I forget the name of the general. but basically sends in the regular army to kick them out of DC. A terribly dark opinion, or not opinion, terribly dark time, especially given the Depression. So, but yeah, Hoover for me is D tier. I think Coolidge is A tier president because he thought the presidency was secondhand and was most common shill president that we ever had to serve our country. I could see that argument. I guess that's more of a philosophical difference for me. Coolidge was definitely more of a conservative, small government kind of guy. Actually, I forgot to mention. I think it's Cleveland, I believe, that had more vetoes, like hundreds of them, than any other president, because he was another person that looked at presidential authority and thought, I'm not to be able to do this. Hoover for me is another one that is a good president. Not a good president, but a good person. I would agree. I think Hoover was a fundamentally decent human being, but just terrible commander-in-chief. Sorry, I'm pausing because the chat looked like it was buffering for a second there. Make sure everyone's still with me. The streaming software sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. But on to another S tier president, FDR. I'm going to get a lot of flack for this one too, mostly from people who were opposed to the New Deal or a lot of it. And I'm not someone that thinks the New Deal was entirely great. But you have to look at something like Social Security and just putting people back to work at a time when, even if that was just building outhouses, unemployment falls like 8% over his first term, which again is a big achievement. And a lot of the times when you're the president, people, even if you're not getting immediate results, people like to feel like you're doing something. They like to feel like you're in the arena and you're fighting for them. And FDR did that. He was a fantastic communicator. His nighttime chats, on the radio definitely reassure a lot of people, and his leadership in World War II is just phenomenal. Now, obviously, the internment camps, boo, Ben would be pissed. Yeah, Ben Shapiro can kiss my ass. His presidential tier list, and I did a reaction to it. Absolute joke. Just a joke. But FDR is the GOAT. Everything from Social Security to beating the Nazis. I would say beating the Nazis, yeah, that's pretty goated. So, to me, the saddest part is that FDR doesn't live to see the end of the war. And again, I think Truman did a great job. Executive Order 906 moves him down for me. Again, I completely understand if the internment camp thing moves him down for people. And it is definitely a stain on his legacy for me. But taking into account the overwhelming success on a foreign policy front, as well as other domestic policy, it's just when you add it all up, it's greater than the sum of its parts. And again, you can't argue with the results. The only guy to get elected president 4 times. So for me, Roosevelt, again, I think this is a pretty cold take among most people. I don't think anyone in this chat would say he's anything below an A or a B. But for anyone who wants to say FDR is the worst president of all time, that's just right-wing cope and nothing less. Now, on to who I would consider to be an underrated president. Harry Truman, A tier. To me, Truman is one of the greatest men to ever hold the office. David McCullough's book on him is absolutely fantastic. A man that, despite failing in quite a few aspects of his life, outside of the army, but basically in every business he ever tried, was just a fundamentally good man of character. For anyone who doesn't know, don't mention FDR died in Warm Springs, Georgia with his mistress and not Eleanor. That's right. And I've actually been to his house in Warm Springs. His daughter was actually the person who handled his flings and affairs. But yeah, dies up there with his mistress and not his wife. FDR was definitely, he had that dog in him. Even though he was crippled from the waist down, he wasn't going to let that get in his way. But with that said, Harry Truman, 2 quick stories on how I would judge this man. When he was the county judge in Independence, Missouri. That's the town. I forget the county name. I think it might have been Jackson. I don't remember. One of the two. He was tasked with getting the roads paved. Basically, the first paved roads in this tri-county area, or this tri-city area. And the Pendergast family, who obviously helped him get into politics, sent cronies and said, hey, give us the job. And he said, well, you give me a good price and you show me you can do a good job, I'll give it to you. And those roads, for being put in the 1920s and 30s, lasted for decades. The precursor to the highway project under Eisenhower happened under Truman in Missouri. And when he was on the Senate committee for 10 years, he was infamous. I mean, one time he had to vote for something about trains. He went to the Library of Congress, got every piece of reading material he could about trains so he could make a fundamental, informed decision. And he brought that into the presidency. He was not always successful, like trying to end a coal strike and trying to end a steel strike towards the end of his term. But for most economies, they take a nosedive after war because you have a lot of military personnel become unemployed. You have a lot of manufacturing and industry that's shut down. To me, Truman is just an underrated president, did a phenomenal job. And the fact that he had like a 19% approval rating when he left, because despite the thriving economy, inflation was a little high, but outstanding president. I don't fault him for the decision to drop the atomic bombs. Expediting the end of World War II was a fantastic thing to do. He did not know about the Manhattan Project until he became president. And actually, Truman is the reason that once both parties assign their candidates, they start getting briefings, because he never wanted anyone after him to walk into the presidency without having every piece of information they could have. Now, with that said, he was only vice president for like 80-something days before FDR died. He didn't necessarily have a lot of time to get briefed. Him and FDR were only ever actually together at the same time in the same place like 3 times. Truman was just kind of a pick because FDR was concerned about getting reelected again for some odd reason. But Truman, fantastic president, and I will die on that hill. Now, another president who, for me, I kind of struggle whether he's S or A tier. And for me, Dwight Eisenhower is S tier. From the Highway Project, ending the Korean War, sending the National Guard in to make sure there's integration in public schools, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The man just, considering he couldn't stop having heart attacks, the man got some stuff done. One of the greatest presidents of all time. I think Republicans even like Truman for the most part, shows how strong he was. I agree. And a lot of that comes... Truman was more of a centrist for sure. And Truman also integrates the military, which kind of starts the splintering of the Democratic Party along Southern lines with the Dixiecrats. Starts the civil rights movement moving under Truman, so another bonus point for him. I would say A+ for Ike, but really close to S. Yeah, again, I wouldn't disagree with that. But for me, Eisenhower is just the definition of a successful president. An excellent communicator, a man who, despite many of his own racial feelings, put a lot of that on the shelf to see things again, like sending the National Guard into Alabama, into Mississippi. Again, the Interstate Highway Program, it's something we take so much for granted now because it's been around for 70 years. But that was Eisenhower. Literally, the highway infrastructure of this country from coast to coast was Eisenhower. Eisenhower was great, but not S tier. Again, I would not argue with him being A tier, but to me, he is just the definition of a successful president. S tier for me. Well, and again, at the end, we'll kind of revisit some of this and see if we want to move anyone up or down. We'll take some votes. Now this one's gonna be a little controversial for people. Truman had balls. Ordering the dropping of atomic bombs was a very hard decision. He didn't regret it. Absolutely. And you see this in Oppenheimer, where he basically tells Oppenheimer, "You let me handle the politics. You handle the science." He was a very objective man. JFK. At best, he's B tier. Someone made the point to me earlier in the president's subreddit that it's hard to give Kennedy credit for the Cuban Missile Crisis when it's the Bay of Pigs that sets that into motion. And I would agree and disagree with that only because early in Kennedy's term, he really was taking advice from people that did not have his best interest at heart. And he was doing his best to listen to the people he thought knew what they were talking about. When Kennedy gets the ball rolling for himself, he's a fantastic leader. Obviously, it gets cut short. We don't get to see what, the end of a Kennedy term or even a second one would have been. I think we'd probably view him a lot worse if we saw him presiding over Vietnam, which I think he would not have ended. It probably would have ended sooner, but I think Kennedy still would have had Vietnam going all the way through a second term. And obviously gets the ball rolling on a lot of the things that LBJ ends up doing, but he didn't have the political wherewithal to get it done. And a lot of that came from him being a Northerner, and being a Catholic. A lot of people just did not like him for that. He barely wins the election in 1960 over Nixon, but Kennedy, a fantastic communicator, a president that would give the country goals. We're going to go to the moon by the end of this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. At least Kennedy isn't a disaster like LBJ. Well, Al, you're not going to like this next ranking because LBJ is A tier. I like RFK more than JFK. JFK was face, Bobby was the heart and brains. I like Robert. He didn't have the tenacity needed to be the president. And here's my hot take. He wasn't going to win in 68. He wasn't going to win the primary, and even if he did, wasn't going to win the general. The Kennedys by that point were the establishment, and in the Vietnam era, the establishment was not a good thing. That's why Hubert Humphrey got mollywopped by Nixon. Now, LBJ, foreign policy, not great. Expansion of Vietnam, not necessarily great. And don't get me started on the Gulf of Tonkin, because that is the most misunderstood event perhaps in foreign policy history. But on a domestic front, a staunch racist Southerner who comes in and turns the civil rights movement on its head. And he does this in a variety of ways. He gets Supreme Court justices to recuse themselves from cases by putting their children in places of authority, so there's a conflict of interest. The smartest politician we've ever had, perhaps. I mean, just a man who knew how to game the system and get what he wanted. The Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, the Great Society, particularly Medicare, Medicaid. You just cannot underestimate these things. And I don't even necessarily put the blame for Vietnam in LBJ's lap. And you know what, Jackman, you're not wrong. He may very well be S tier. He basically was the second coming of Roosevelt. Just obviously without the success of the war. So for me, it's hard for me to make a guy S tier when he basically bails out of an election because he's afraid to run it. But LBJ is one of the greatest presidents of all time, and I will die on that hill. Now, Nixon. Nixon actually has some good W. Maybe I'm biased, but I just cannot agree with LBJ being that high, even with all the legislation he passed. Again, Connor, I completely understand. A lot of people don't like LBJ from his personal behavior because obviously of Vietnam. Definitely was a scoundrel, to say the least. And he doesn't do much for Humphrey in 68 to try to help him win. If anything, it seems like he's rooting for Nixon. And obviously, if you're someone who's more of a conservative mindset, a lot of the Great Society you would view as government encroachment. But to me, he's very high. Nixon, I'm going to put in C. Establishes the EPA, gets us off the gold standard, which is good for economic growth. Obviously, Watergate's bad, the corruption's bad. Nixon's obviously a very crazy guy. And there's actually a funny quote of his that I heard, I believe it was in the book Nixon Land, where he basically says, domestic policy, that's for other people. Foreign policy is where it's at. He really didn't care much about domestic policy. He wanted foreign policy. Obviously, he runs in 68 by saying, we got to get out of Vietnam. And then it wins again in 72 by saying, well, we need to leave, but with strength. Peace through strength and all that stuff. Let's withdraw with some dignity. Just brilliant politician. You got to give him points for that. Obviously, the corruption and all that bring him down, but I would strongly suggest people watch any of his post office interviews, the ones he did in the 80s and 90s. He's a very brilliant man. And there's a lot of open relations with China. Not a terrible thing in my opinion. Not a big fan of the bombing of Cambodia, but to me, a good middle of the road president. If he had just kept his head out of his own ass and not been such a lot like LBJ, such a paranoid freak and always thinking people were conspiring against him, he probably would have been higher. Obviously, the man loses the 1960 election and stages a comeback 8 years later. Gotta give him credit for that. Another middle of the road president, Gerald Ford. The man's given an impossible task. Takes over, in the wake of Watergate and does what he thinks is the best thing to do in pardoning Nixon to help the country move on. I disagree with that decision, but I could see his rationale behind it. To me, Ford and Carter are two sides of the same coin. And as an Eagle Scout, he's an Eagle Scout president. I think Ford, in some instances, tries to go too far to the right to placate, to try to get the nomination in 76, and obviously almost loses it to Reagan. But I think is a man that tried to restore some normalcy to the office, tried to lead with dignity, just didn't have what it took to stay there. Nixon is hard for me. He's got a lot of highs and lows. EPA ending the forced draft are highlights, but his foreign policy was up and down. Disagree with him on the gold standard. No, and here's what you can't lock your currency to a finite resource like that because you'll never have growth. The United States is not the economic powerhouse that it is today if we're still on the gold standard. It just isn't. Nixon's beachier president, even though he is a racist in Watergate, of course. Besides that, his presidency was not as bad as he was smart as hell. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. To me, I'd keep him at C, because he removes a lot of dignity from the office, I think. But Nixon pardon was the right thing to do. I mean, I understand why Ford did it. I wouldn't press it, and say that it was the wrong thing to do. I wouldn't have done it because I think at a certain point, when you can show that even the highest position in the land can be held responsible for their actions, I think that's a good thing. Sorry, guys, I'm getting some update about the Bears game. Haha, the Bears win, yes. Sorry, guys. But Carter, also someone that I would put in C tier. I think a terribly underrated president, very legislatively successful, just a man that he didn't listen to the Nixon adage that you have to govern the world as it is, not how it should be. I don't blame the Panama Canal debacle on Carter. The country did not want to fight another Vietnam over the Panama Canal. And for his time with one of the most legislatively successful presidents ever. Now, obviously, he could have done a lot more. He comes into the presidency with a supermajority, 61 Democrats in the Senate. In his first year was not great. He proposes a tax increase and then backs off around Christmas because of high economic activity related to the holidays. But you got to give the guy credit for basically getting elected president by shaking hands on the street. And obviously, as a native Georgian, I'm a little biased towards Carter. Carter's the first to make it to 100. He is only president to live that long, our longest lived president. And I would highly recommend everyone go down to the Jimmy Carter Center if they're ever in Atlanta. Fantastic presidential library. Now, this one is going to get me in some trouble. Ronald Reagan, D tier. The most overrated president of all time. From a domestic policy standpoint, where do you begin? He passes a Carter saw a UFO. Yeah, that story is out there. Reagan passes a tax cut that just decimates the economy, and this is what a lot of people don't know. Over the course of his presidency, passes 11 tax increases. That by the time he's done doing all that, 50% of the initial tax increase he did had been negated through basically having to fix the mistake he made. Iran-Contra is just straight up treason, just ignoring the AIDS crisis, letting his cabinet run wild. People always talk about like Biden, being shadow puppet president, but that really was Reagan. He either was incredibly inept or incredibly corrupt, one or the other. Obviously doesn't start the war on drugs, but really ramps it up, which is another reason Nixon's lower for me, the war on drugs. Lets his wife's medium give him advice for running the country, which is just straight up insanity. Just destroys, again, begins kind of that Republican idea of destroying the government so you can then privatize it to your buddies. He did have a good sense of humor, and he was a fantastic communicator, and that's why a lot of people remember him fondly. He was funny. People had seen him on TV and film for 30 years. He had been a popular, if I would not consider successful, governor of the biggest state in the country. And the only thing keeping him out of F tier was his domestic policy. Not domestic, his foreign policy. I do not give him straight up credit for ending the Cold War, but the arms race and ramping up our spending, while not great for us necessarily fiscally, helps to end the Cold War, which obviously ends under H.W. Bush. But to me, Reagan is just an abysmal president. We like Reagan here in Illinois. If we would be more claimed by California. Even if he would be claimed more by California. Because I'm pretty sure Reagan was born in Illinois, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, to me, Reagan, one of our worst presidents. We don't get Trump without Reagan, so that kind of gives you an idea of how I feel about him. But Reagan, awful, awful president. Funny man, charming man, tall man, but bad president. George H.W. Bush, kind of Reagan light in a way, in terms of carrying on policies. I would say a man of more integrity, more of a statesman. He didn't have the charisma, I don't think it took really to Dixon. Okay, yeah, so I was right, from Illinois. To me, H.W. Bush is a good C tier. Was the war on drugs more of a hindsight thing where people thought it was a good idea at the time, not knowing how it turned out? I wouldn't say so. You can go all the way back to the 1920s and 30s with people like William Hearst running smear campaigns about marijuana. One, to keep their interest in the timber industry, but two, also to basically criminalize the behavior that they saw minorities committing. There were ads in the paper saying black men are going to smoke reefer and break into your house and kill your daughter, all that kind of thing. And the war on drugs basically just became an excuse to lock up minorities. To me, you should be able to do whatever you want so long as you're not hurting other people. And especially if you're just going to smoke weed and things like that. The war on drugs has been one of the more costly and ineffective policies this country has ever implemented. So I'm not a big fan. Carter, to me, is the most underrated president. People look at his presidency and say the Iran hostage crisis and say that his legacy did more than he wanted. I agree. A lot of the peace deals in the Middle East come from Carter, which you got to give him credit for. He helps. He gets Egypt to stop bombing Israel, and that was a feat in and of itself. Basically, Carter ends most of the Middle Eastern fighting with Israel outside of Palestine during his presidency. Clinton helps a little bit with that later on, but Carter, fantastic president. H.W. Bush, again, another excellent man of character that not always the most effective. The war on drugs is the dumbest thing our country's ever done. I'd say right behind slavery. Yeah. It's repercussive effects in terms of creating a wealth disparity between the races just cannot be understated. And we're starting to dial that back a little bit. Even Trump is talking about rescheduling marijuana, and I think that's a good thing. Drugs are great and war is terrible. Drugs are bad, okay? Drugs are bad. But now on to Bill Clinton. Clinton, again, kind of the way Ford and Carter are the same side of the same coin. Clinton and H.W. Bush are kind of the side of the same coin, but I would move Clinton up to B. Obviously, I'm a big fan of a surplus, a budget surplus, balancing it. Clinton, I think, and obviously he only wins in 92 because Perot siphons votes away from Bush, who probably would have been reelected. You don't get 430 electoral votes and not get reelected otherwise. But to me, Clinton is a more successful administrator. Energizes kind of the youth vote in the country because he's one of our younger presidents to that time. I think he's only 50, 51 or 2 when he gets elected. Obviously a thriving economy under his watch. I
the Monica Lewinsky stuff, again, it's been beaten to death. Obviously not good, but the silliest impeachment this country's ever had. And hopefully we see a trend of impeachments kind of declining as time goes on. But Clinton, to me, easy B tier. Now, George H.W. Bush, I'm sorry, W, because I like you. I do. But you D tier. The Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, No Child Left Behind, the Patriot Act, the Postal Service Accountability and Reform Act, which destroyed the post office for 15 years. Just bad. Am I going to rank them in the tiers? Yeah, we could probably do that at the end when we're rearranging stuff. We could do that. But for me, H.W. Bush, a great man of character. I respect that after 9/11 he stood up and said, we're not fighting Islam, we're fighting terrorism. But just from start to finish, just terrible. I don't put the housing crisis at his feet. A lot of that had to do with policies under the Clinton administration, but obviously the economy just takes a huge downturn. I mean, the man has the record for the highest approval rating of any president, and then leaves with like a 30% approval rating. Again, for Bush Jr., not a good president, but good guy. I agree. Fantastic. I think a good quality human being, but just a terrible president. Barack Obama. The first presidency that I really can remember living through, I remember in 6th grade watching his inauguration. To me, I think his presidency is a lot of wasted opportunity. Now, obviously, he's saddled with a Congress after his first midterms that basically wouldn't let him get anything done. To me, the Affordable Health Care Act is incredibly underrated. And to me, someone who, while did not live up to the hype of his campaign, governed with decency and ethics and morals in a way that we haven't seen really in a while. And I think one of the few presidents that probably could have gotten a third term. To me, I'm going to put Obama in B. Solid president. There was never a moment for me when he was in office where I was concerned for the country, where I felt like we didn't have a competent adult in the room running things. And given his relative lack of experience, it's pretty inconspicuous how good of a job he did. The Recovery Act, while crony capitalism isn't really my thing, a lot of that starts under Bush, but you can't argue again with the results. The bailout of the can't even speak. The automotive industry and making them pay back those loans, fantastic stuff. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and Obamacare is a lifesaver for me. Was a lifesaver for me as a 5-year-old. I mean, people don't understand, because again, I think that it's been so long that people take it for granted. But the idea of your insurance can't kick you off for having a pre-existing condition is so powerful for people. Obamacare is not perfect, and we shouldn't need to subsidize basically privatized insurance to people to have it, but it's certainly better than what we had before. 20 million people have health insurance that didn't have it before, and it might be expensive, but they've got it. For me, Donald Trump is the worst president of all time. I don't know anyone that watches the channel is surprised by that. I struggled for a long time with whether he was worse than Andrew Johnson, and it's because at least the things Andrew Johnson did were not flagrantly illegal. Obviously, other than the 10-year of office act, which was ruled unconstitutional. But Donald Trump is the worst president of all time. From constant trade wars that destroy, I mean, even for farmers that are the bread and butter of the Republican base, he screwed them over twice. And he somehow managed to be worse this time. The man is trying to instigate martial law by getting citizenry to fight with law enforcement. I mean, it's just, when you lose 90-some-odd% of your court cases, you know you're doing unconstitutionally bad things. And if not for the Supreme Court just handing him W's left and right, I mean, he's usurping legislative authority in terms of withholding funds that Congress has already allocated. Um, just malicious and mean in terms of gutting things that Biden did, like what was the tax credits for EVs hurting, and just doing silly things like, and during his first term, repealing a ban on lead and bullets because yes, you know, an animal needs to suffer after being shot by being poisoned from the inside, just things like that. Repealing, you know, automotive emission standards that Obama negotiated during the bailout to say that we need to get cars to be more fuel efficient. Just terrible. And the dumbest president we've ever had. You listen to that man speak, the dumbest son of a bitch to ever sit in the Oval Office. And I will die on that hill. Donald Trump is the worst president of all time, bar none. And now we will finally conclude with Joseph Biden, who to me, A tier. Sue me, people. I do not blame the Afghan withdrawal on him. I blame that on Trump for a year letting the Taliban run roughshod on the deal that he negotiated with them. I strongly opposed the COVID vaccine, the mandate he tried to implement federally. That was not good and was an overreach of presidential authority. But you cannot argue with the economic recovery of the United States outpacing the rest of the world. Because if you guys remember from back then, the Fed said that the only way we're going to get out of this is basically to force a recession or to force unemployment to spike. And for him to do, with unemployment to stay low, and inflation for as high as it got to come down as fast as it did, and the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, the IRA, just the most legislatively successful president in 60 years, obviously too old to run for re-election, should have bailed out. I'm a liberal, but Biden was literally not conscious for most of his term, by definition, not A tier. I don't understand why people are so polarized with Obama. I don't hold strong opinions. To me, he was a decent president. The hate from Republicans is way too overblown, and some of the love too. I think a lot on the left just comes from him being black. Just put it bluntly. For me, Biden, I disagree with the statement that he's not conscious for most of his term. Bill Maher put it succinctly, saying he can do the job, he can't run for the job. And that's just the way I feel about it. Presidential historians put Biden, I think, at 14th. I think I'd pretty much agree with that. I could be convinced that he's B tier. Obviously, doesn't have a kind of, you know, but getting NATO countries to up their spending to fight fascism, you know, to help Ukraine. I just, the hate for Joe Biden, well, again, one of the most decent human beings to ever be the president. If there was ever a person who understood the middleman like people want the president to, it's Joe Biden. Now, someone said, I think Connor said, let's rework them within the tiers. I think if we were to do that, I would probably go this way. Let's see, Jefferson. That one's right. Let's see, let's move Grant up. Let's move Polk up. Let's move Kennedy. Let's move Obama right here. Let's move Clinton here. Nothing stands out really. Let's move Carter here. H.W. Bush here. Forward here. Any major quaffs with this? Anyone want to move anyone from any tier to another one? Move anyone up, move anyone down? Let's see. This is we can move. I think these are all good. Go here. Yeah. So this is my presidential tier ranking. What does everyone think about it? Any major adjustments anyone would make? Move John Quincy Adams to B. Yeah, I'm fine with that. We move John Quincy Adams to B. We'll give this another minute or two and then we'll wrap it up. I want to appreciate everyone who joined in tonight. It's been a riveting discussion. I was frankly quite surprised by the amount of agreements I got. Move Polk to A. Let's see. Move Polk to A. I'll tell you what. If you can get 2 more people in the chat to agree, I'll move Polk to A. Clinton to A. No, Clinton's not A tier. I like Clinton. He's not A tier. Again, if you can get 2 people in the chat to agree with you, move Nixon to D. Not upset by C. Middle between A and like B plus, C plus, D plus, F plus. Polk is A. All right, we'll move Polk to A. Polk can go up to A. The motion has been seconded. Polk is A minus. Yeah, I mean, he's kind of similar. You know what? A lot of his strongest qualities are a lot like Jefferson's without some of the weaker ones. Yeah, I would agree Polk is A. All right, any more adjustments? Going once, going twice. I'd like to thank again everyone who jumped in tonight. It was one of our more successful streams in terms of people jumping in. I appreciate all the commentary. We'll probably do this again, maybe in a year or so, see if any, as I continue to read about the president, see if any of them change. But until next time, guys, remember,